Well, here we are again in our answer series. And the question for this week came from my class, and the question was this: why should we render unto Caesar who is destroying God's values? Well, that's a pretty good question if you ask me. It really is. You know, living in America where we live, there have been times where we thought, hey, Caesar's doing good for us. And then there have been times when Caesar's not been doing good for us. And it kind of ebbs and flows through the decades a little different and depends on whoever's the president and all that type of thing. Which way God's values are either supported or they are rejected. Well, the actual full question that came was, how can we render unto Caesar when Caesar is trying to destroy every godly value? Well, good question, good question. So as an introduction and background, the story that we all know, because we know the words, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, just a quick summary of those testimonies. Matthew presents his own personal story as he remembers it. Mark, in his writing, presents the eyewitness testimony of Peter the apostle. Luke writes down the eyewitness testimony of Paul, who was not Paul at the time. He was actually a Pharisee in the Sanhedrin who was known as Saul. So we have an apostle, the tax collector Matthew. We have Mark, who was the son of the owner of the upper room where the Lord's Supper was given. And he traveled with Peter, and so he wrote down Peter's eyewitness account. We have Luke, Dr. Luke, the medical doctor, who after Saul had his Damascus Road experience with Jesus and became a believer, became Paul. And of course, Paul was blinded at the Damascus Road experience. And even though the scales fell from his eyes, he never got his eyesight really back. And so Luke is Paul's constant silent partner wherever Paul goes, and is always with Paul. And Luke writes down Paul's eyewitness account of Jesus when Paul was still a Pharisee. All three of these, from the tax collector to the missionary who traveled with Peter and to Dr. Luke writing Paul's account, all these three storylines are almost identical. Now Jesus, if you remember, made his way to Jerusalem on the last Sunday of his life. It was a day of celebration as his triumphal entry into Jerusalem just enthralled all the crowd. But in case you did not know it or did not remember it, it was the 10th day of Nisan. It was the day that back in Egypt, the Lord had instructed through Moses for everyone to select a lamb for the Passover meal on Sunday, the 10th day of Nisan. And they would take that lamb into their home and they would treat it like a pet and they would fatten it up. But on the 14th day of Nisan, they would sacrifice that lamb and eat it at the Passover meal. So the 10th was on Sunday, 11th on Monday, 12th on Tuesday, 13th on Wednesday, and the morning of the 14th, which is Thursday, they sacrificed that lamb, they cooked it up, and began the meal before sundown on that Thursday afternoon. So the people are just enthralled, and what happens is Jesus, a donkey is brought with a colt, and Jesus climbs upon it, and he travels 2 miles over into Jerusalem there on Sunday. And at the temple, when he gets there, Jesus gets down off of the donkey and he begins to walk through the temple complex. Well, what he sees is, he sees the market of the temple was a den of thieves and robbers. This is Sunday evening as he sees all that, and it just bothers the dickens out of him. But he doesn't do anything on Sunday night. Jesus left the temple that night, that evening, that afternoon. He started his going into Jerusalem probably around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He made the turnaround and heads back to Bethany, and there he spends the night. Well, on the next morning, on Monday morning, a few things happen as he heads back over towards Jerusalem, but Jesus returns to cleanse the temple of the thieving marketeers. So he turns over all the market tables and all of that. And the scribes and the Pharisees, if you remember, they had permitted all these marketeers to rob the people. And you say, well, how did that happen? Well, the scribes and the Pharisees were in charge of the market there at the temple. And they were allowing the people to charge excessive prices, far above the normal prices in all the rest of Israel. And so the biggest crime that was occurring there at the market was the unequal change rate of the value of the coins, to changing it over from the Roman coins into the temple coins. You see, the temple accepted only temple shekels as an offering. They were gold shekels and there were silver shekels, and each with different values. And the reason why it's different values is because gold and silver of the same size does not have the same weight. And so the shekels did not have, of the temple by the way, did not have an image of a person stamped on them. They had some temple symbol on them, such as you see here, a basin of water, or an olive leaf, or a menorah, or a pomegranate, or something like that. But in Jesus' day, living in the Roman Empire, the government had coins too. And on all the government coins, there was either the picture of Caesar or some other governor of Rome or politician were always stamped on these coins. Now, I want you to understand, as we kind of look at this map of the Roman Empire, you see that little circle that I have there in red? That's Jerusalem. And the rest of all that color that you see there is the Roman Empire. Well, here's the interesting thing. It's easy to understand. It was impossible to drive a herd of unblemished sheep, the tenth of the sheep that you needed to tithe, to the temple, or a herd of cattle, the tenth, unblemished, okay, when you start out. It was impossible to herd those animals all the way from Britain, Spain, North Africa, Algeria, whatever the country was at the time. Egypt was called Algeria, and Monaco was called North Africa at the time. It was impossible to herd them without causing damage to them, so that when they arrived at the temple, they would still be unblemished. The same was true of all the other types of animals, the birds that could be brought, the grain, the oil, or even the drink offering of the wine. You just couldn't guarantee that you could take that offering and get it there in time in a way that it would be unblemished and it would be a perfect offering to give to the Lord at the temple. And so the priest allowed the people where they lived to sell their offerings locally in exchange for Roman money. Now, once they arrived in Jerusalem at the temple, they could then go into this market to exchange, especially if they just wanted to give money to the temple, they could exchange this Roman money for temple money. The only problem was the value of the money should have been virtually equal to the value of the weight of gold or the weight of the silver at the time, plus the addition of a small transaction rate at the time. So any gold coin of Rome should have been able to be changed for the same equal weight of either gold or silver shekels with just a little exchange rate so that the marketeers could make some money. The problem was the exchange rate was way off. The transaction charge was absolutely enormous. Thus, these marketeers took advantage of the required offering in the exchange process in order to make really huge, just large profits. Now, all this was done under the authority of the Sanhedrin, as well as all the religious political parties. The religious political parties were Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and Essenes. And because it was on the temple property, the Sanhedrin members controlled the cost of the booths paid by the marketeers. So if you wanted to come and you wanted to do something inside this market, you had to rent a booth from the Sanhedrin. Now they divided the booth money, the booth money paid by the marketeers. The Sanhedrin divided that amongst themselves. In addition to the salary, the wages that they were paid from the taxes collected by the Jewish authority that was governed by the Jewish King Herod under the authority of the Roman Empire, which also collected taxes. And so you've got all these taxing entities who are taking money, okay? And these religious Sanhedrin men were in full subjection to the Roman Caesar because their salaries came really and truly from the taxes that Caesar collected by way of King Herod, by way of the tax collectors, by way of the taxes that were also imposed, and everybody got a little piece of the pie. Of course, Caesar got the most of the pie. Well, if you remember, Matthew, who became an apostle, was actually a tax collector before he was following Jesus. He collected taxes for both the Jewish governing body and the Roman Empire. And by the way, the tax rate was set by the Roman Empire. The tax rate was set by Caesar, how much everybody has to pay. But the tax collectors were not paid out of the taxes. No, they were paid out of what they could overcharge in the tax rate, and they could overcharge for as much as they could get out of the people in the district. And as you know, there's another little story that Jesus talks to us kind of about, that's where we talk about it, where the tax collectors did not collect taxes justifiably across everybody. In fact, if you were family members or whatever of a tax collector, you were exempt from these taxes. So the government's whole tax system and the temple market's excessive prices were set up to overcharge the people. The market exchange rate method is called usury in the Bible. We see that in Nehemiah 5:7 and Nehemiah chapter 5 verse 10 and Proverbs chapter 28 verse 8. Usury is the exchange of money at an exorbitant rate of interest or an excessive premium paid to a marketeer to facilitate the exchange. Well, when Jesus called the businesses there in the marketplace a den of thieves or robbers, we see that in Matthew chapter 21:13. So we all know these stories. Well, on that Monday afternoon, Monday morning, I should say, after cleansing the temple, Jesus sat down and began teaching the people there in the temple, and members of the Sanhedrin came to challenge Jesus on what authority he was teaching and what authority did he have to cleanse the temple. So the Pharisees, the Herodians, the scribes, they asked Jesus a question in an attempt to trap him in some form of heresy. That brings us to Matthew chapter 22, verse number 16, which says, And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their malice and said, Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And then he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now you can also see this same passage over in Mark chapter 12 around verse 17 and Luke chapter 20 around verse 25. The words of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are precisely the same. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Well, Jesus caught these religious leaders in their own trap right there before the people by pointing to the image on the coins. Get this, Jesus rightly recognized and acknowledged the existence and the practical recognition that Caesar was the head of the Roman government, and it was not merely lawful for him to collect taxes, it was the duty of the people in the Roman Empire to pay him the taxes due each year. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, Jesus said. Now these religious men of the Sanhedrin were in full subjection to the Roman Caesar because their salaries came from the poll taxes that Caesar collected. Now once again, Jesus caught them off guard in their own trap, and they were hypocritical with their question, and Jesus knew it. However, Jesus did not just stop by just affirming the rights of Caesar. He connected the dots. He continued to affirm the rights of God when he said, and to God the things that are God's. Now, basically what we need to realize is with these two different coins, the Roman coins and the temple coins, one was your civil tax, the other was your act of worship. One was mandatory whether or not you liked what Caesar stood for. The other was your gift to the Lord from the blessings He provided for you and for your livelihood. Everywhere that Caesar's coins were used, he had a right to collect taxes for whatever he wished to spend that money on, whether it was moral or it was immoral. He had the right to collect those taxes. But for the Jews, there was a whole tribe of the nation of Israel that existed that the Lord did not allow to own property, did not allow to own fields of grain, or pastures filled with livestock. They were the Levites, the tribe of Levi. And they were priests of the worship of the Lord. Now they were not Pharisees, they were not Herodians, they were not scribes, they were not Sadducees, they were not Essenes. They were not all those members of the Sanhedrins, not one of them was a member of the tribe of Levi. Of course, what is going on by this time is in order to be one of those Sanhedrins, basically those positions are being passed down from generation to generation, to son to son to son to son, or they're being bought. In order to buy them, you have to be able to own stuff to sell it and all of that. And the tribe of Levi was not allowed to have anything. They were not part of the Sanhedrin. There was no Pharisee. Remember, Saul was a Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin. He wasn't of the tribe of Levi. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. So the Levites were in charge of all the things of God. The tabernacle, I mean, not the tabernacle at this time, it's the tabernacle to begin with, but at this time they're in charge of the temple, and they're in charge of everything else going on around the temple and collecting the offerings of God, not the taxes, but the offerings. Well, it's interesting that by the time of Jesus, the high priest and his sons and their families, of course, were there in Jerusalem, just like they were in the days of David, when David moved the Ark of the Covenant there. They had been charged of the tabernacle over in Gibeon, and before that over in Shiloh. But when David brought the tabernacle to Jerusalem, and then he finally, and with the Ark of the Covenant there, all the high priest and his sons all moved to Jerusalem, and that's where they led the worship from. But get this, all the rest of the Levites, they were scattered throughout the villages and the towns all over Israel. And I've got a picture slide here of those towns. Every place. There were 48 Levitical cities. And that's where these Levites lived. And they served as ministers of God, overseeing the Levitical law that was given through Moses, that also looked over and they took care of all the needs of the people from these 48 Levitical cities. And of course, these are not all the cities, but these villages that are around these Levitical cities were close enough to go and worship the Lord in these Levitical cities. But once a year, they all went to where the tabernacle and the temple was there in Jerusalem. Now these Levites, they had to eat. They had to have a place to live. They can't own anything, but they had to have a place to live and they had to eat. So the Lord provided them with food and with lodging through the system of the tithes and offerings. And even their houses did not belong to them. They lived in homes that belonged to members of the other 11 tribes who blessed the Levites that lived in their areas and gave them these homes to live in free of charge. They did not belong to the Levites. The Levites just got to use them and live in them. And that, of course, blessed the members of the other tribes. But by Jesus' day, the high priest had also become the de facto president of the Sanhedrin. You get it, you've got all these 70 Pharisees, scribes, Herodians, and all that. There's 70 of them, but who's the president of the Sanhedrin? And by the time of Jesus, which this all occurred in between Malachi and the book of Matthew, when this happened, the high priest became the de facto president of the Sanhedrin. He was the only one in the Sanhedrin that met with the Sanhedrin of the tribe of Levi. And as such, his political and his religious beliefs were usually in lockstep with the 70 members of the Sanhedrin. Well, not all the Sanhedrin members always agreed. You don't always have total agreement across any organization, but they pretty much were in agreement on just about everything, even though they had different shades of what they agreed on. Thus, in Jesus' day, the man by the name of Caiaphas, who was the high priest, he was in lockstep with the Sanhedrin, who wanted Jesus trapped in a heresy, from a heresy that would come from Jesus' own lips. They wanted it so that it would be the last week of Jesus' life. They had put up with Jesus for 3 years, and they were fed up with him. So at the time of Jesus' ministry for that 3 years, we need to look at how the Roman government truly was destroying the values of God's values in the Roman Empire. I've titled this part, The Destruction of God's Value in the Roman Empire. Well, at the time of Jesus' ministry, Tiberius Caesar was the Roman emperor. And Tiberius Caesar was the most perverse and abusive of all the Caesars. Did you catch that? All the Caesars, from Julius Caesar all the way to the last Caesar, Tiberius was the most perverted of all of them. It was during the time that Jesus lived. The Caesar, Tiberius, was the most perverted. Folks, he had the walls of the imperial palace in Rome painted with pornographic pictures. He enlisted boys for terrible entertainment. He abused guests at banquets that he would throw for the purpose of abusing the guest. He was most noted for his pedophilia. And if anyone complained to Tiberius or anyone else, he had their legs broken. Now, I'll just be honest with you. When I did the research on Tiberius Caesar, my first draft of this for your lesson was very, very graphic. And in fact, when I handed this lesson to both of my editors to edit out the grammar and all that, they both came back and said, this is too graphic. So what I've just told you is a real watered down version of what I found. What I found is that in the last years of his life, people were so sick of Tiberius's perversion that they secretly called the palace the Old Goat's Garden. They were sick of it. Now, all this story, I could give you much, much more, and I know way more than I want to know. I now know so much about how perverted this Caesar was. These stories are detailed in the writings of 3 Roman historians, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Suetonius. Now, these were historians in the Roman Empire at the time of Tiberius Caesar. These are eyewitness historians. Now, Tacitus and Cassius Dio were Roman historians for what is happening out in the Roman Empire, but this last one, he was actually the historian of what is going on in Tiberius's life. They all tell us things, and by the way, they all match in what they tell us about Tiberius. But this last one, who is Tiberius's personal historian, his writings are the most revealing because he knew what was going on. You say, well, how did he know all of this? Well, he was in the court of Tiberius as Tiberius's historian, and he had access, as historians do, to all the letters, to all the memoirs, to all the court documents at hand. He also watched as the walls of the imperial palace and Tiberius's private retreat over on the island of Capri were painted with the most depraved images conjured up by the ruler himself. And the record shows that everywhere Tiberius traversed in the empire, debauchery was demanded and expected. People of Jesus' day knew exactly what it meant to have a government that destroyed every godly value. And as we think of the United States, of how our government is destroying the values or trying to moving, and there's some movement that's pushed back on it going on now of the debauchery of the last 3 years that we know of. There's a movement going to push back on it. We don't know where that is going to land. We often think that this is the first government that has just destroyed the God's values, and I don't want to support it. And yet, Jesus, living in the same type of debauchery, said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now, most people think that Jesus' words in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the only link and instruction to the words, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. But they are not. Paul also addresses the topic in his letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 12 and 13, Paul addresses the saved Gentiles in the church in Rome, and also the saved Jewish brethren in the church who are listening to what Paul is saying to the Gentiles. Now, Paul has already finished talking to the Jews while the Gentiles are listening about the heritage of the Jews and all things work for good for the Jews and blah, 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 and all of that. And the Gentiles are listening. And now Paul is turning this around. He's talking to the Gentiles, and he's trying to show to the Gentiles that everything that was a blessing for the Jews before the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ and the day of Pentecost is now offered and available to the Gentiles also. And so they are all listening to this instruction. Now, Tiberius, by the time of chapter 12 in the book of Romans, Tiberius has been dead for at least 21 years. Caligula and Claudius have served their reigns as Caesar, and Nero was in his 4th year as emperor when Paul is writing this letter to the Romans. Nero will behead Paul shortly before he commits suicide in AD 68, 10 years after Paul writes the letter to the Roman church in chapter 12. Remember, Paul writes to the church in Rome from Corinth. And Paul has not made it to Rome yet, so Paul has not even been in Rome. He's not been in prison yet, even though he's going to serve 2 years in prison. And he's going to do that within the next 10 years. But in chapter 12, Paul emphasizes the rights of the Gentiles to be included in the gospel message and the rights of salvation for them to have it also. He also warns the whole congregation, the Jews and the Gentiles, that there are still those who are disobedient to the Lord, but the Lord has provided the way to salvation for all who will call upon His name. And Paul ends that 12th chapter by stating that to all those who are disobedient to Him, that's the Lord, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed them. And if he is thirsty, give him drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that's how Paul ends chapter 12. It is a terrible chapter break, but it is a good setup for a good example of how individuals are to deal with evil at the personal level and the evil that is in the government. So then moving to chapter 13, Paul is going to tell the people how to deal with this government that is evil. They're on that level. Chapter 12 was on a personal level. Now chapter 13 is on a government level. In chapter 13, Paul says, every person is to be in subjection to governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a, get this, minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Oh, my soul. Can you believe it? In verse 1 of chapter 13, Paul warns every person to be in subjection to the governing authorities, because God has placed the order of governing authorities here on earth. Now here's a good place where this map of the Roman Empire of the first century will speak volumes about why it was put in place by the Lord. The Roman Empire was put in place by the Lord. In fact, it was prophesied through Daniel's interpretation of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that this Roman Empire would be in place in history. And to be in place in history, it has to be there for a purpose, and that purpose has to be to provide God's will in the ultimate history of the world. Now I want you to notice in the map and that it included Britain. And in fact, it included all the easily inhabited portions of Europe. It included all the easily inhabited portions of the African continent and the easily inhabited portions of the Middle East, all the way to the Persian Gulf. Now, these were the most populated regions in the world at the time because of the availability of fresh water year-round. So the Roman Empire was one people. Through this whole Roman Empire, they were one people. Now, I want you to look here. I've got lines there. You see that line, the top of the line? That's longitude 60 degrees north. The bottom is the Tropic of Cancer, longitude 23 degrees north. I want you to notice that the Roman Empire falls between these two longitude lines that go all the way around the world. You'll notice above longitude 60 degrees, nothing of that is the Roman Empire, and below 23 degrees, nothing of that below the Tropic of Cancer is the Roman Empire. And why is that? It's because between these two longitudinal lines, fresh water is always available year-round for what they need for crops and everything. And it spans the whole area. But even more than that, because Jerusalem is right there also, down in the Israel area, down just where the Palestine area is there. What's interesting is across this whole Roman Empire, the laws were the same in all the Roman Empire. Through this entire Roman Empire. And it's prophesied through Daniel for this Roman Empire to be in place. It's going to be needed, and it's going to be in place when Jesus is crucified. On the day of Pentecost, it's in place. And throughout the next 1,453 years, it's going to be in place. If the Lord had not put this Roman Empire in place to capture this virtually from Britain and the Atlantic Ocean all the way to India for all practical purposes, the dynamic and the dramatic growth of the church after the day of Pentecost would have been much harder to accomplish. Much harder to accomplish. But get this. Within 90 days, and you've heard me say this, within 90 days after the day of Pentecost, people from all over the Roman Empire had returned to their towns and their villages and established churches in their homes. You see, this Roman Empire was an ungodly empire led by Tiberius, a perverted Caesar, emperor, and this entire ungodly empire needed a savior. And it needed a church in every town and village. Thus we have the background of Paul's words that the Lord has established the government and all needed to be in subjection to it. It truly was a minister of God to you for good. How could it be for good? Because the church just exploded against the whole empire and provided God's word to the Gentiles. That's chapter 13. Across to the entire world. It was for the good of the Gentiles as well as the Jews. Even the perverted empire provided its people with some degrees of protection from the evil people through its laws that were north of the empire coming into it, or south of the empire coming into it, or coming over from the east, from the Orient. Didn't have to worry much about from the west because that was the Atlantic Ocean. But it provided some protection from evil people throughout its laws, with its laws. However, you might say, how was the protection provided? Well, it was provided through the soldiers who were paid. And how were they paid? They were paid through the taxes that were collected from the people. And not all the people were protected. That was impossible. You know how things are. The military, the police can't be there for everything. You know, we complain about our police not being there Johnny on the spot. Sometimes it takes them 10 to 15 minutes to get there because they're someplace else and they're not just ready to run to your issue. It takes them a little time to get there. And I don't know about any place else, but I know in Houston, when there's a 911 call for medical or whatever, boom, out goes the fire department with the big fire trucks to get out there so they can secure the area or help anybody before the police get there. But then the police are on their way. Not all people can be protected by these governments, but at least it's put in place. But most people were protected, which is why the Roman Republic lasted from 750 BC until AD 1453. It's a whole bunch of years. For the last 1400 years of that time, Jesus had come at the beginning of the 1400 years. The church was influencing and changing the laws in the Roman Empire to the Lord's human right laws and of the Old and the New Testament. And unknowingly, the rulers of the Roman government were servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing of being the protectors of good and the prosecutors of evil. The gospel of Jesus changes the laws of the Roman Empire to line up with those human rights laws that are in our Bible. Unknowingly, it happens through the influence of the church throughout the whole Roman Empire. Therefore, Paul tells us to render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due. Would Jesus and Paul tell us the same thing today? Yes. So we ask the question, why? They would tell us the same thing because all the governments of the world are still being used by the Lord to lead the events of the world to fulfill and establish His eternal plans. For His eternal plan to be accomplished, Many of his prophecies are yet to be fulfilled. And the actions of these prophecies to be fulfilled must be fulfilled through the actions of the world governments, which are the tools to fulfill the prophecy. At the same time, the actions of the evil in the world will be revealed, and in the culmination of the ages, they will receive the Lord's just judgment. You say, well, how does that happen? Remember, this whole Roman Empire that's there in the day of Jesus, according to the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar, that the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and that Daniel had interpreted, this Roman Empire must come back together to be the evil Roman Empire of the world that makes a treaty with Israel for 7 years, that leads into the tribulation of Israel where they're mistreated, which leads to the return of the Lord on the day of Armageddon, of which all the evil in that revived Roman Empire are there at the valley to be destroyed by the Lord. So the Lord can set up His millennium, His 1,000 years that leads to the peace of Jerusalem, which is what our lesson was about last week. That why should we pray for the peace of Jerusalem? Because it is the culmination of the ages where the Lord comes to reign for 1,000 years. The Lord would say to us today, I am still using the governments. As bad as they are, and as evil as they are against my godly ways and values, I am using them to obtain what the plan is to eradicate evil from the world. That's the context of the story of why we should still render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, because the Lord needs those governments in place. He needs our government today in place, and we should render to Caesar. And get this, remember the passage from Paul in Romans. If you don't pay your taxes, you are disobeying the Lord.